My name's Dave Ripplinger. I'm an economist with NDSU Extension. I work primarily in bioenergy and bioproducts, looking at market opportunities, working with businesses to commercialize new technology or to look at opportunities. Today, I'm going to be talking about energy broadly within the state of North Dakota, bringing us up to date with what's happened primarily within the last year, and then provide both a short and somewhat long-term outlook on what's expected broadly in the energy industry, and then how that might affect the state. So a couple of key points as we start. North Dakota, we're a producer of energy. That's our role in this. We're not a large market. We're not large consumers of energy, but especially in terms of crude oil and electricity, we're dominant, and we also have a significant role in biofuels, as well as having some wind and some hydro. But again, too, we're basically sitting on one side of the market as it affects us. We talked about this already today, so this idea of COVID impacting the economy. And I'm going to speak specifically to that as it's impacted energy, particularly use, because that's really where things have been coming in on the demand side, on the use side. There's two common phrases used within the last 9 months as COVID has impacted our life, not just our economic life, but ourselves more broadly. The first is this idea of COVID as a disruptor. And that refers to this idea that COVID has impacted a lot of, just pull up my chat here. Oh. Let me see what I'm doing here. Give me just 1 second. Oh, is that better, Frame? I think that must be right now. Great. Thanks, Frame. Yeah, and so just going back to these ideas that we have COVID as disruptor. So again, we've had these short-term impacts, which were not foreseen. And we've seen this in all parts of the economy, the idea that, we couldn't necessarily travel to work. Maybe our businesses were closed. Maybe some of the things that we do just weren't possible anymore. Again, the disruptor is the idea of these unexpected impacts, both short-term and long-term. The other thing, and what's really important on the energy side, is COVID as accelerator. One of the things that we've been talking a lot about in the energy sector is this idea of an energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels generally to increased renewables and all the things that might come with that. Technological innovation, resource limitation as we use fossil fuels, and policy. And really what we've seen is COVID has accelerated a lot of this, or at least discussion of this. And some of those other social or economic phenomenon that we thought might take time are coming to a head a lot more quickly. COVID has also led to a significant amount of economic and social uncertainty. We see that. So in general, there's a lot of consensus in where the economy is going. And it's generally on this upward trend where, we've had an economic recovery, and many economists, most economists think that we'll be back to where we were by the end of 2021, which is great news. But there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. Thoughts about possibly having another decline in the economy broadly at the national level as some federal programs end. And then also just what a lot of folks are going to do as their lives and their livelihood is really changed. And so, not only do we know that things are different, but we're not exactly sure, how we're going to get through the next 12 months or so, in part because of COVID, in part because of economic impacts of COVID. And then, as I mentioned too, this idea of this energy transition, this is that longer term transition that's been taking place in energy really ever since we even started using fossil fuels over 100 years ago. There's never been a common quiet state in energy. We've always been adding or changing our mix, electrifying different power generation and the like. And so it's just looking at how that's going to change over time. So one of the first charts I want to talk about, starting on the behavior issue, is looking at what we've been doing in terms of transportation in the United States. Transportation is a major user of energy. About a third of our energy in the country is used in transportation. From a North Dakota perspective, obviously crude oil fuels much of our travel, be it by automobile, by aircraft, by a railroad, by a heavy truck. But we've seen quite a change, almost entirely due to COVID and some of those economic impacts coming afterwards. So this chart is using data from US DOT. So the Bureau of Transportation Statistics has a monthly report with this and other data. It only goes through August, but I think it illustrates kind of where we're at and where we're going. And just kind of walking through some of the highlights of this. So this looks at air ton miles, which is essentially air freight, vehicle miles traveled, which is passenger travel by car, air passenger miles, which is air travel for pleasure or for business, railroad car loads, again, which is freight, and truck tonnage, which is freight. And some things to bring up is kind of what's going on. I think probably most surprising is that air freight is up. And I think this is pretty understood with the amount of things that many people have been buying using Amazon. That a lot of those parcels are moved by air in a short amount of time. So that's really the only sector where we've seen an increase in use, with everything else having not so good a news. But again, that change, it kind of crossed over there in April to May, where things really picked up. And again, those levels of air ton miles, that air freight, is higher this year than it was last year. Again, thinking about COVID as accelerator, I think many of us saw, maybe waiting for 20 or 25 years for the end of brick and mortar. As we talked to the turn of the millennia, it's maybe now maybe come to pass where Amazon is taking this large part of the economy, and again, in this case, because of COVID, something we didn't see a year ago. And next, look at vehicle miles traveled. Again, so these are passenger miles traveled on a monthly basis. And again, what we saw was this really immediate fall in travel by car for a number of reasons. Stay-at-home orders where you couldn't, you were discouraged or not allowed to leave your home. People choosing to work from home, limits on other trips for whatever purpose. We saw that collapse. And so you see that significant decline, almost falling by half, not quite, and then recovering just a little bit later. If we look at something similar happened in air, but much miles in March and April. Again, there were still planes in the air. There was still service in general being provided, but many of the routes were temporarily put on hiatus. Some have been canceled. And then the folks who did fly were oftentimes flying on pretty empty planes. And you don't have the information for it, but you can look at some of the enplanements in places like Fargo and Bismarck, and there was just a significant decline in boardings, and obviously that would translate into these air passenger miles. Kind of going further too, it never really recovered. If we see that, it kind of went forward just a little bit. It's gotten a little bit of legs, but nowhere near to what it had before. Freight and truck tonnage also fell. And if you really think, those are the industrial sides of the economy, moving materials, moving equipment, all of those things fell, and it has recovered in large part. It didn't fall as quickly or steeply as passenger travel, again, because the economy was still rolling, but it did decline, and it hasn't fully recovered. This translates really well into looking at refined products. So here's a chart of supply of refined products. This is essentially leaving the refinery or the blender in the market. The vertical line at about week 12 is essentially that onset of COVID. And you can see right at that point for the finished motor gasoline market, so this is blended, ready for retail, we saw that immediate decline of about 50% within a matter of weeks, and then a slow recovery, and then kind of a steady level of use since then. Right now, it's averaging about 85% of the use that we had pre-COVID or last year at this time. We look at distillate fuel oil, so that's diesel. I did decline. It actually was slow to do so as freight movement and the like was moving relatively steadily. Also, planting kind of impacts this. Agriculture uses a lot of diesel fuel nationwide, and especially North Dakota. For the most lagging just jet fuel market kind of that lava coming off that barrel, where we saw that significant decline in use in a partial day. So again, and that quick dip in gas, an all but complete recovery. One question is, where do we go from here? Obviously, a pretty strong recovery in diesel, and then finally sitting there with jet fuel, with not getting to where we were. And even in the short term, in the next year or so, there's not significant optimism that we're going to see an increase in jet fuel use. In this chart, we're actually going to go now into prices and kind of look at what's happened with prices. These are wholesale market. So New York Harbor CBOB, which is gasoline ready to blend, New York Harbor ultra low sulfur diesel, and U.S. Gulf jet fuel. As you can see, I mean, if kind of just following the chart, we see that decline in prices actually before COVID really hit, and that was the beginning, or the existence of some skirmishes between Russia and Saudi Arabia, tightening, getting into a little bit of a price war, oversupplying the market, which had that immediate impact within the first 2 months of the year, and then finally that collapse. You can see that CBOB, again, which is gasoline, CBOB, which is gasoline, falling significantly, immediately, diesel trailing, and jet fuel trailing. I mean, obviously a significant issue. The recovery's been different, and I think this is really important. So if we go and look at the first usual situation, which is diesel is a bit more expensive than jet fuel, and it's almost all we've seen a flip in that over the last few. Diesel and jet, the lowest cost. Again, this is being by use. Folks aren't flying. We don't need the jet fuel, and so it's being sold at a discount. The other thing to look at too is this green line, which is this spread between diesel and jet fuel. So just the difference between that diesel price and that jet fuel price, and you see this spike. And where this is really coming from is that lack of demand for jet fuel relative to diesel. And now what we've seen is much more interest in finding ways to hydro treat that jet fuel to make diesel, which we'll actually use. Has a downward impact on both of those prices. It's good news for diesel buyers, which includes industry, which includes agriculture, but that exists, and it's not good news in general for the crude oil industry, for the refining industry. And next, I'm going to move into some data from the Federal Reserve of Dallas. They in Kansas City take kind of a leading role in looking at energy. Reserve Bank, where they ask folks involved in the industry what their break even is for as well as for existing wells. So actually go and start a new well, what price do they need? And so we can look across these different basins, finding the Bakken at $51 a barrel, which is pretty comparable to the other basins. It's also important to note that there's a range, or we have that $50, but for some lower cost producers it could be 40. For some higher cost producers it could be. See a lot more flexibility, and in fact, I look at the Permian and Delaware. So this is the western side of the Permian. Their average is about the same. Low end is lower. We've actually seen activity in the Permian in the last few years and through COVID, and we have in the Bakken. And in fact, piece of trivia for you, for 1 month-ish, so July, August, New Mexico was actually the #2 oil producing state, exceeded North Dakota's production for that period of time. And again, that's this Delaware issue. They're able to have more drilling activity than we see here in North Dakota, at the prices that have been prevailing, which is about $40. Moving now into shut-in prices. So for these are existing wells, That same survey, asked folks in industry, at what price would they shut in a well? In the Bakken, it was $28 a barrel. And again, this is WTI, so this is the same benchmark that Jeremy uses in his analysis, in his economic forecasting. It's generally the North American benchmark fuel, and especially for the Bakken. The Bakken does the North Dakota Light Sweet, which is the predominant Bakken, moves closely with this just for WTI prices, so we can compare across all of them. Again, we're looking at $28 a barrel, which is not as high as some places, but higher than others. And so we can look and see exactly what this meant to the economy. We can see here Department of Energy from the Energy Information, 51 and $28 even. So the 28 is for considering shutting in a well. And so we fell below that $50 mark. Actually, you look at that at the turn of the year. And this is, I think, alludes to that North Dakota was already starting to stumble a little bit in terms of the economy at this time, and fell precipitously with COVID. And we had that day in late April where we had negative prices for spot and for futures. And it's a good learning lesson. In case anyone asks, yes, futures can go negative, spot prices can go negative. There were a few things going on. One was a lack of storage. There was difficulty finding storage. The other was a number of folks involved in the markets in one way or another didn't recognize the downside risk that they had, and they had to ride it into a very tough place. Since then, we've seen a recovery in those prices, those WTI prices, dancing around $40 a barrel. And every day it seems like there's some really good news or maybe some bad news about what's happening with WTI. In the last 2 weeks, it's been COVID-related vaccines, some concern about OPEC production. That's kind of made it dance around, but it's really been sitting in that same range. So again, there's that drop falling below that break-even level. And that kind of moves us into this, where we have daily oil production and rig count. So we've seen that decline in rigs throughout the year, again, falling even before COVID really hit. And we've been at right around 10 rigs drilling for oil in the last few months, since COVID really hit, made its full impact in about May in North Dakota, followed by this decline in production. And so we can go back a little bit and just talk about the story. So our first story is 2014 and that decline in rig count. So that was Saudi Arabia making the announcement that they're going to be driving down global oil prices, North Dakota responding with that significant reduction and the impacts it had across the state's economy. And then more recently, we've had COVID leading to this more recent downturn. And again, following along with that is this decline in actual production. But that decline in production isn't all about the new production coming online. It's actually about shutting in some wells temporarily. And we can actually see this with this red line. So this is producing wells. We can see that decline. It's the left-hand axis declining from just under 16,000 producing wells to just over 12,000. So almost a 30% drop. Over 25 within a matter of weeks. That impact and has a number of also there's always this relatively large reserve in North Dakota of wells that have been drilled but not completed, and we saw that the completion of those wells, so that's doing that final fracking and bringing it online, that just fell precipitously. So we had wells being shut in and then wells not being completed, and then more recently we've seen a lot of those wells coming back online, which has led to that increase in production. So there's our bottom point with producing wells, again, because of shut-ins, and then this recovery. as many are not, and we now have a limited number of rigs active in the Bakken. This chart I also bring up too. I think it's really important, and it's a point that needs to be made that might be common knowledge for any of you, and that's the relative efficiency of rigs in the Bakken or even nationwide in these shale oil developments. Looking at the number of wells drilled per rig, and so this is on a monthly basis. So if we go back to the beginning of this period, back to 2014, we were averaging between 1 and 1.5 wells drilled per rig per month. And that, is increased dramatically in the 5 years following. For a period of time, we can get 2 to 2.5 new wells per rig, which is fantastic. And so the reason I bring that up is because these rig numbers can be somewhat deceptive. And so we might have had this decline from the peak of just over 200 rigs, then kind of coming back to this 50 level. Well, based on their actual productivity, that's actually closer to 100 2014 rigs in the state. And of course, right now with 10, that's really too low to say anything positive about. Moving over to biofuels, just briefly, biofuels tracked what was going on in the gasoline market closely. They actually responded more quickly to the impacts of COVID. I think for a couple of reasons. First, most ethanol refineries are smaller entities than oil refineries. Their balance sheet is not as deep. The other thing is that they don't have the number of products that come off of a distillation tower, out of a refinery. You'll get your ethanol, you'll get distillers' grains, you'll get some corn oil, but as opposed to a oil refinery of all these aromatics and different products that are going into these different markets. And so within a matter of a week or two, we saw that ethanol production and use just collapse. And again, it was about the same magnitude, just much more quickly than gasoline was, falling by about half. Again, almost all ethanol used in the United States is added to ethanol as E10. Almost all gasoline sold in the country is E10. And so that moving in tandem kind of made sense, but it still wasn't quite quick enough. So in that bottom half of the chart, we see that increase in stocks, and that increase in stocks, which is similar to what we saw in oil and some of the refined products, did whittle away relatively quickly in ethanol because they responded quite quickly to the situation. For crude oil, if you looked at those May numbers, they were at 55 or 56 days in storage, which is a tremendous amount of oil, and we're really looking at running out of storage space, which again led to that collapse in prices. And now more recently, like with gasoline, we've seen a recovery in kind of this plateau in terms of production and use, and we're basically sitting about 90% of where we were a year ago, which is much better than where we were in the spring, but not a full recovery. There's 2 very large ADM corn ethanol plants that have basically said they're going to remain shut down for the year. And that's a tremendous amount of production, which is nice because the absence of that supply is supporting prices. Next, going to look at relative electricity use by sector. A lot of things going on in power. This is looking at U.S. data. Similar things happen at the state level within the region. But I did to kind of illustrate this impact of stay-at-home orders and that change in lifestyle, which is so critical to energy use, is what happened when looking by sector. So we have a commercial, industrial, and residential percentage. So just of all power used, how much was used in these different places. And so if we look at that aqua line, that light blue line, you can see for that commercial percentage is significantly lower, notably lower within this period, within 2020. That's the 2020 line. Same thing with industrial use of electricity as a proportion of the whole. And then finally, residential use has increased significantly. Now, there's a couple things that have to be addressed in this. First is a significant amount of electricity is used for heating and cooling. And so, particularly, cold days in winter will lead to a spike in electricity use, particularly in the residential sector. And then, of course, in the summertime when it's warm, we can have a spike in in use for cooling, again, primarily in the residential sector. But EIA, this Energy Information Administration, has done a study and found, that even adjusting for that, there's been this shift to residential use. And again, this is really important because as our lifestyles change, if we were going to continue to have, millions of Americans work from home, not travel, not have that daily commute, possibly continue to buy a lot of retail items online, which has seen that spike in air freight, that has serious long-term implications to the economy. And again, the big thing to point out in this chart is that disproportionate use of power in the residential sector this year. And again, that'll likely continue for at least the next year or so. Again, wondering, what might that new normal be? Looking at net generation, so there's some really important things that have been going on. This is part of that broader energy transition concept that I mentioned earlier. This chart shows net electricity generation from the dominant sources of power in the country. Going back to 2014, on that left-handed axis, we see that coal was providing about half of our power. And should say 2004, 15 years ago, they were providing about half of our power. Now it's down to less than a quarter, so it's fallen by about half. Similarly, we saw natural gas providing some amount, and it's now the largest single source of electricity on the grid and expected to continue to grow. Nuclear, which is that light blue color, has been relatively constant. Hydro has been constant. And then the concern for those in the fossil fuel industry is the emergence of solar and wind. There's still only a relatively small part of total generation. And I should step back and note too, so this is generation, so electricity generated, not actual capacity. So this is how much electricity came off the wind turbines and off the solar panels, not how much was installed. Again, because we know that the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day and the wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day. But this is actual generation. And again, those numbers for renewables are not inconsequential, and they're growing at a really steady clip, especially solar. And it's something we're all keeping an eye on. Folks who are pro renewables are giddy with what's been happening recently and through 2020, but others are more concerned. Just a note on the recently announced coal power plant retirements. Couple of things going on. There's stressed economics. There's also regulation, threat of regulation. It's really not a great time to be in the coal power business. Just this year in May, we heard an announcement from Great River Energy that they were going to retire their Coal Creek Station, which is by Underwood. It's 1.2 gigawatts of coal power coming offline. And then Dakota Spirit, which is Spirit Water by Jamestown, GRE announced that they're going to be converting that completely to natural gas as the economics for lignite don't work for them anymore. This is added on to some previous announcements. So we had Stanton Station, Lewis and Clark Station, and then the Heskett units by Mandan. Heskett, they're going to be the coal units are being retired, being replaced with natural gas units. Again, not a great time for coal. And it brings up a term that should be in everybody's hip pocket in the state, and that's this concept of stranded assets. And so stranded assets is this idea that there's capital out there that no longer has enough value to be utilized. And so if we look at these different assets, so that Coal Creek Station in and of itself, so that the power plant itself is going to be a stranded asset. But going along with Coal Creek Station is the Falkirk mine, a tremendously large lignite mine that has, decades, hundreds of years of coal left in it, which is no longer economical to use, at least under the current situation. Not necessarily saying that they're going to stay stranded forever, but it's really a troubling situation, again, because we have such significant lignite resources in the state. Also, people are looking across the globe at other assets. We're seeing this in the oil refining business. Shell just announced that they're going to retire a large refinery in Louisiana and the like. So some of these assets, which have had an extremely important role in providing energy to the country, are coming offline. So now kind of moving more into the outlook side of things. I want to start with a note, and that's on horizons. And sometimes this gets a little bit confused because depending on your horizon, you're going to be seeing different things. And so in general, when I think about this short-term horizon, I'm thinking about the next year or so through the end of 2021. And then I'm also looking at what's going to happen in the next decade, which is still relatively short-term, and then for the next 30 years or so. And so we hear a lot of talk about what's going to happen by 2050 in terms of policy or in terms of new technology or of new behavior and the like. And so it's really important to be kind of clear on those things. So what I'm kind of looking at in terms of of oil is obviously we're looking at COVID-19. We're seeing increased levels across the country, especially here in North Dakota. That has an impact on public health and our movements and our energy use. It also feeds back into the possibility of an economic recovery. Again, the consensus is the economy will have recovered by the end of 2021. There might be some sputtering around that, but again, that's the general thought. I mentioned earlier this idea that OPEC is making some noise about what's going on, what they might do in terms of increasing or decreasing production to achieve a price target. Just had to add Iran, this morning as there's activity within their nuclear sector, which is not appealing to the current administration. If anything happens with Iran, all bets are off, and you can say 60 or 70 or $80 oil. And then finally, this policy issue, I'll talk about that a little bit more. Energy is significantly impacted by policy at the state and national level. And with the election that just passed, there's a lot of things that the market's looking at and how it might impact crude and other parts of the energy industry. Longer term, I'm wondering what's going to happen with consumer behavior. And so that's one reason why I started with those transportation statistics. What might that look like in the future? Are we going to be driving? What vehicles are we going to be driving? When and why and how are we going to be traveling? Where are we going to be living? And how is that going to impact energy? Again, still looking at technological innovation, resource availability, and again, policy with that longer term perspective. And again, with some states making some very long-term goals with regards to energy. So this is a chart from Energy Information Administration. Again, a lot of different groups put out their forecast of what they expect near-term prices to be. You could go to build a forward curve with current WTI futures prices. EIA is usually somewhat conservative, but definitely a well-respected source. Their expectation from their short-term energy outlook, which is updated regularly, they're looking at about $45 price of WTI. And so again, let's sit back and think, okay, our break even for shut-ins was 28. Our break even for new wells is 51. Well, 44 is less than 51. So we're really, this price, if this price realizes, we wouldn't expect a significant increase in drilling activity in 2021. That being said, there are certainly possibilities where all bets would be off. The green dots are actually made with futures, with options on those same WTI futures, saying, the market could fully expect prices as high as $80 a barrel or back into the 20s. We won't know, but again, there's a lot of different things that could happen in the near term that could cause that price to move. One of the things to talk about is the electrification of transportation. I get this question a lot. There's a lot of concern, and there's been much more talk that I've heard in the last 6 to 9 months regarding the energy transition and this rapid movement to new technologies and new platforms. And one of those is the electric car. And so this is a EIA a chart as well of what they're expecting by 2050. And EIA is actually quite conservative in their expectations of adoption of electric vehicles. If you go to Bloomberg or other sources, they're expecting it'll be at least half of the fleet will be that type. But if you look at EIA, they're looking at, electric vehicles, including just hybrid vehicles, just being in the millions, not half of the market at 9 or 10 million vehicles on the road. And so That's kind of what they're expecting. Again, there's thoughts all over the place of what electrification could look like, spurred in part by state policy or federal policy. And EIA even says, if they're looking just at the market driving issues, these are the numbers they get. If there's significant carbon policy, the numbers change a bit, but not as dramatically as Bloomberg expects, as some of the others expect. And so it's definitely something to look at. So much talk about it, but there's still this excitement when somebody sees a Tesla on the road in Fargo, because there's truly not that many of them, and they're really not today, a vehicle made for the masses as they need to be to see, to get anywhere near a 50% market share. Talking now about electricity, again, some figures from EIA, starting on the left-hand side. So this is generation from different fuels. We'll just go all the way out to 2050 on that right-hand side of the axis, seeing that natural gas is a major contributor to power, but it's actually passed by renewables, solar and wind, likely in combination with some battery backup, and of course natural gas being the primary base load as well as peak provider of electricity, nuclear declining and coal declining. But I think it's important to note too, the EIA does not expect coal to disappear. And my question is, how viable is North Dakota's lignite industry with potential new policies, with the economics of operation, with carbon sequestration, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But again, this is what they're seeing in the future. And within that coal number, which is something obviously paying a lot of attention to, it definitely doesn't tell me that North Dakota coal is going to disappear. Looking at that chart on the right, they break down where they actually expect this generation to come from. And again, this is generation, not installed capacity. So for those, for that generation, they're expecting almost half of it to come from solar, which is a lot considering where we're at today. Wind providing the next big piece, hydroelectric being relatively constant, and some others, some geothermal and some biomass. But clearly, to get to those levels, we have to see a lot of solar installation, both utility scale and distributed solar to come online. But truth be told, we've actually been growing at a faster rate than most folks have been expecting through 19 and now through 20. And so those are definite possibilities. Just to kind of sum up what's going on in power, there's significant economic pressure on coal generally. Most days of the week, it's not a low-cost producer. In the middle of the night when there's less demand, but the coal-fired power plant has to run, you do see times where they're paying for the grid to take power, or receiving a very low price. And then of course these policies that are on the horizon could be absolutely devastating to the industry, and we'll know about that in the upcoming weeks and months. I'd like to make a note too about some of these strange bedfellows that exist. This is, to me, some interesting things have been happening. Having been involved primarily on the renewable side, on the biofuel side for quite some time. The petroleum and biofuels industry are now on the same page, and in many cases working together. They've realized that they're no longer fighting over how much of the tank they have. They're now working to make sure that internal combustion engine is the dominant system for automobiles. And so to fight off those concerns about electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, all of those other vehicles, you're seeing them work together. The petroleum folks recognizing that the low carbon nature of biofuels complements their business relatively well. Again, a year ago, that likely wasn't the case. Looking at fossil fuels and decarbonizing the economy, looking at two things, electricity generation using fossil fuels for electric cars. Generally, there's not a lot of love between the electric car folks and the power folks. But of course, if you're going to use coal or natural gas generated electricity for electric cars, that works out just fine for both of those groups generally. And then finally, something that's getting more and more interesting is the conversion of idled or potentially idled oil refineries, as we've seen that decline in use, being converted over to renewable diesel, which is a biofuel. I'll speak about that at length in just a couple of slides. Some notes on low carbon fuel standards. So California was kind of the first state and organization that kind of got in front of developing policy to support incentivizing low carbon fuels. So their low carbon fuel standard has ended up being the template for other states, provinces in Canada, the nation of Canada, and other nations, Colombia, Brazil, as they're looking to decarbonize their fuel. And it's worked well for a number of reasons. One is that California is a large market. It's got some unique considerations. But again, they're simply working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with transportation. And they're not prescribing how that needs to be done. They're just simply saying that we want emissions to be at this level, and market, you go find out how to do that. And that's led to a lot of opportunities for the biofuel industry, but other fuels as well, including those that are fossil fuel based. Some quick notes about carbon capture, use, and sequestration. This is really going to be the big story for much of the state's energy industry for the next decade. There's concerns about carbon emissions with the climate, concerns about the climate. And the idea with carbon capture and sequestration is we can capture some of that carbon and likely bury it in geological formations. It's not a free technology, but it could be appealing to either keep existing assets viable or to generate some tax revenue. So that's at 45Q in the bottom left hand of the screen. Right now, getting carbon out of the system is highly incentivized, and so folks are going to do that. Some of it is driven by markets, typically policy-driven markets. Some are right from the law itself with certain levels for capture and sequestration. You know, Project Tundra is looking to capture and sequester carbon emissions coming from the Milton Young Station, which is by Center. A major project that's underway that would allow them to reduce their carbon and generate a number of those 45Q credits. We're also seeing this on the biofuel side. This is being driven in part by states like California, who have their low carbon fuel standard, as well as the idea generally that these are kind of research questions that could end up to paying off even more in the future. So Bluefin Ethanol, which is co-located with Coal Creek, which is now scheduled to be closed, is looking at carbon capture, as is Red Trail, which is in Stark County. Looking at those same things, capturing CO2 off the plant and putting it in a geological formation. Renewable diesel, I mentioned before, there's been a tremendous amount of interest in biofuels as that California carbon market has become established and created a market with some very significant incentives for low carbon fuels. Renewable diesel is top of the list in that because it has an extremely small carbon footprint and it's a drop-in fuel. So it meets the diesel spec. There's no blend considerations. That being said, what we're missing right now are the fats to put into it, the lipids to put into it, for saying available feedstocks. And so the typical ones, soybean oil, canola oil, grease and fat, are known, but they're looking for anything. And of course, the prices are so large that it might spur the production of other industrial crops to supply these facilities. My picture on the right is now, it's an old piece of news from just over 2 years ago, where the Marathon plant in Dickinson would be converted to renewable diesel. It's now being commissioned. And in short order, we'll be producing renewable diesel for the California market. And just to give you an understanding of the magnitude of this, the recent price of renewable diesel in California has been about $7.25 a gallon. And so that's a significant premium to diesel, even in the California market, and enough to get a lot of folks to pay attention to this opportunity. And we're somewhat fortunate that Marathon and Dickinson have been aggressive in this, and we have a facility in state. And again, again, this is one of those three in terms of crude oil refining. Some last quick notes too, looking at other systems, energy systems, and especially from that North Dakota perspective, a lot of interest in hydrogen and ammonia. The idea is you'd use those gases as the fuel, put into a fuel cell technology, make that electricity and power a vehicle typically. It's of interest broadly. In part, we can produce this hydrogen with renewable energy. So wind or solar, we could get that hydrogen or ammonia in place. But probably what's most appealing or interesting to North Dakota is blue hydrogen. And this would be the idea that we would create the hydrogen in state using steam likely using steam methane reformation, but then sequestering that carbon. So we would have associated gas, that methane coming out of the Bakken, making hydrogen at a facility in state, and then putting that CO2 back in the ground, possibly for an enhanced oil recovery, but likely not. And so those are some really interesting opportunities. The reason there's a lot of interest in ammonia is a bigger molecule, and we also have an infrastructure for ammonia in place. Some of my last comments is just what to watch for. Energy is extremely tied to policy, and there's a lot of policy uncertainty right now. And so this is just a quick list of what the market's looking at. We have a Senate runoff in Georgia, which will determine the control of the Senate. If the Senate does switch to Democrat control, that will lead to an aggressive agenda. If that doesn't happen, there are still already continued discussions, additional developments every day about different regulatory options the new administration can take. Some of those are not going to be fossil fuel friendly. Some of those relate to DAPL, but that's also a court issue. We had a bit of a scare this summer with DAPL being ordered to shut down. But what happens with that is not completely known. And of course, DAPL plays a critical role to the viability of our crude oil industry in the state. It shrank the spread between North Dakota Light Sweet and WTI by $5+ a barrel, meaning that North Dakota producers get that back because of DAPL, and that really needs to stay in place for the industry to remain viable. All of these discussions about net zero, especially at the state level, some at the federal level saying, by 2050, the economy will have net zero carbon emissions. So there might be some emissions in other spots, and then sequestration in others. I listed clean power plant. So that was a draft EPA policy that would have set limits on emissions from power plants. That was tabled with then actually kind of dismantled with the Trump administration. I haven't heard talk of it coming back, but that same mentality could come back in another form. And then finally, things that courts might be doing in this space. And those are all things that we're looking at in terms of policy. One thing I note too with all of this talk about renewables is I would like to step back to 15 years ago. 15 years ago, the consensus was that the nation, like it is now, was moving very quickly towards renewables. And so there's this environmental sensitivity, these concerns about energy security and national security related to energy, and then these possibilities of economic development. And so there were a number of actions that took place in terms of federal policy, in terms of the vehicles that the automobile manufacturers were designing and bringing to market. And then shale oil happened. And so we can't necessarily say that any of this is foregone because 15 years ago, people saw a future that didn't happen. And those same things, are certainly possible now. But again, the impetus or the common line of thinking is that we are moving more towards renewables, and that has serious implications for the state. And so that concludes my comments, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And of course, if there are none, I'll gladly wait a minute or so. You can use either the Q&A feature or the chat feature for questions. One thing I'd also mention is that tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock at the same URL, we'll be having office hours with some of the presenters, so we can discuss some of these issues further. Well, it looks like there's one question. Great. Thank you so much. Oh, is corn ethanol here for the long term in your opinion? Yes. Corn ethanol has established itself in a number of ways as an indispensable fuel. So I would say that corn ethanol is going to be here as long as the internal combustion engine is going to be here. Ethanol, so talking about gasoline, gasoline has a number of specifications. We design engines for certain fuels. Corn ethanol is the lowest cost way to provide octane to those fuels. And so, it's not going anywhere. So that's just on a basic internal combustion engine issue. There's actually a lot of opportunity as we look at those low carbon fuel standards for the market to grow. Right now, the economics for E15 and higher blends, are shaky at best. But in some cases, E15, just from a strictly financial standpoint, is a lower cost fuel for the energy you get and the miles you get from your vehicle. But in low carbon markets like California, they significantly incentivize corn ethanol, to the amount of dimes a gallon. And, if you're talking about dimes a gallon, going back to a corn ethanol refinery with 100 million gallon capacity, you're talking about some serious money, an increase in revenue of millions of dollars a year. Right now, I didn't talk too much about corn ethanol margins. They were really good for much of the year. There was that immediate feedback that the market declined, and it's come back, and the margins have been really good. Now we're kind of at the point where they're back to nil or maybe negative, depending on how you count financing the plant. But again, it's it's doing relatively well. And long term, I'm generally optimistic because depending on the price of E10 regular gasoline, E15 might be advantage, and market development around the world as other parts of the world are looking at octane, and U.S. corn ethanol is almost always the best option for that. Okay, question about the wind sector. So North Dakota is a large wind energy producer compared to other states. What's your outlook for the wind energy sector in North Dakota? Well, that's actually, to me, not an economic question, but a political question. Our potential in energy is basically second or third in the country. And yet, in terms of actual investments in energy that we produce, we're nowhere near that. With the retirement of Coal Creek, we now have access to a transmission line with excess capacity. And if we decided politically that we wanted to invest more in wind energy, we'd have a lot of the means to do that. But some of that is limited in terms of the political arena. Oh, yeah. And so a question about hydrogen. Is hydrogen competitive? So hydrogen now, there's a couple of things going on. So we don't have the infrastructure, right? Hydrogen, fully built out energy source. Really what it does is it provides it becomes a low carbon fuel. If we produce it with fossil fuels, natural gas or coal, like we do it, Dakota Gas, it becomes a way to get those fossil fuel resources utilized. Right now, we simply don't have the vehicles to best use it. You can operate slightly modified diesel engines to use hydrogen. We actually did that at NDSU a few years back. I think we did both a tractor and a truck converted to hydrogen. Issue with vehicles that don't sell fuels, but it's definitely a possibility. I'm part of a regional roundtable looking to develop that, and it ends up being a really appealing, promising opportunity. But today it's still 5 or 10 years away, and I would caution that, because that was the old joke in biofuels where it was always 5 years away. There's a lot of organizations that are actively pursuing hydrogen. I just read earlier this morning that Cummins is looking, at that hydrogen fuel cell for semis. And of course, that's what you need. And that's need the engine manufacturers, the auto manufacturers to handle. The challenges with hydrogen, again, is it's a little bit more challenging to move by pipeline, and there's interest in moving fuels by pipeline, but you could do that with ammonia. So they end up, to me, being kind of in a similar space. Thank you for the question. And it looks like we've exhausted the question. And so I want to thank everybody. We'll be taking a bit of a break and welcome you back after that.